there was an Adam and Eve, and you visualize the garden they were in and the snake and their interactions, there you have it.
For thousands of years, the story of Adam and Eve has been told the same way in churches across the world. We've heard about the serpent, the forbidden fruit, and the exile from paradise.
Case of a woman standing near a tree and a snake coming up to her and saying certain things, and they have a conversation.
But an ancient Ethiopian scroll called The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan tells a completely different story, and it has left historians and believers questioning everything they thought they knew. Before Eve died, she revealed details about Eden that don't match traditional or the biblical teachings. So, what did Eve really witness in paradise? And why were her final words buried for centuries? Join us as we uncover the truth. The luminous law and the secrets of the first 80 days. Most people assume Adam and Eve were created directly inside the Garden of Eden. They picture God forming them from dust right there among the trees and rivers. But the ancient Ethiopian texts reveal something completely different that changes everything we thought we knew. Adam and Eve were not created inside paradise at all. They were brought into the garden only after a waiting period that followed very specific spiritual laws, and this detail alone reshapes the entire story. Adam had to wait 40 days before he could enter, but Eve had to wait twice as long, a full 80 days, before she was allowed to step through those sacred gates. This wasn't random, and it wasn't about punishment. This waiting period established the first laws of spiritual purity in human history, because the garden wasn't just a beautiful park where the first couple could walk around and enjoy nature. It was a high-level sanctuary that operated under rules far more strict than anything we understand today. The numbers 40 and 80 appear throughout Scripture as periods of purification and testing. But here's where it gets more intriguing, so keep watching to find out. Why was Eve's entry delayed compared to Adam? The ancient text suggests it had to do with the process of her creation and the special role she would play. She wasn't formed directly from the earth like Adam. She was taken from Adam's own body, which meant she needed additional preparation before entering the sacred space. This detail changes how we think about the garden entirely, because Eden wasn't open to everyone. It had boundaries, laws, and requirements that had to be met before entry was even possible. Inside the garden, the laws of nature worked differently than they do in our world today. And one of the most striking differences was the source of light. We're used to the sun being the primary light that allows us to see during the day. But Eve described something entirely different when she spoke about Eden before her death. She said the sun was not the main source of light inside the garden. Instead, the air itself glowed. The trees emitted their own light. Everything had what the text calls a luminous garment effect, and this wasn't poetic language or symbolic imagery. Eve was describing an actual physical phenomenon that existed in paradise. The light didn't come from above, it came from within everything around her. But here's the catch. This changes the entire understanding of what happened when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. Most people are taught that they suddenly felt ashamed when they realized they were naked. But the Ethiopian texts reveal something far more profound. Because when they ate the fruit, they didn't just gain knowledge of good and evil. They actually lost a physical layer of light that had been covering their skin. This luminous covering was part of their original design. It was a garment made of glory rather than fabric, and the moment they disobeyed, that covering vanished. They were left exposed in a way they had never experienced before. Their shame wasn't just emotional, it was the shocking realization that something precious had been stripped away from their very bodies. Eve also revealed another detail about the garden that most people have never heard. And this is where the story gets even stranger. Before the fall, every animal possessed what the ancient text calls the gift of tongue. This means the animals could speak. They had language and could communicate with Adam and Eve in ways we can't imagine today. The garden was filled with conversation. Birds sang words, not just melodies. Cattle spoke with understanding. The relationship between humans and animals was nothing like what we experience now, because they were companions who could share thoughts and ideas. But when Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise, this gift was taken away. The mouths of all the animals were stopped. Silence fell across creation in a way that broke Eve's heart, and she later said that one of her greatest losses wasn't just leaving the trees or the rivers. It was the moment the animals went silent and could no longer speak to her. However, the serpent holds a special place in this story, because most people picture a snake slithering on its belly, hissing and deceiving. But Eve's testimony reveals that the serpent didn't always look like that. Before the curse, the serpent was the most beautiful and clever of all land animals. It walked upright on legs like a man. It had a form that was stunning to look at, which is why Eve wasn't immediately frightened when it approached her. The creature seemed noble and trustworthy. But after the deception, God cursed the serpent in a very specific way. Its legs were taken away. It was forced to crawl on its belly and eat the dust of the earth. And this wasn't just a symbolic punishment. It was a biological transformation that changed the very structure of the creature. Eve witnessed this transformation. She saw the beautiful upright beast reduced to something that slithered in shame, and that image stayed with her until her final breath. These details about the garden paint a picture that's far richer and stranger than what most people have been taught. Eden wasn't just a nice place with fruit trees and clear water. It was a realm where light came from living things, where animals spoke with wisdom, and where the laws of nature bent towards something far more glorious than what we know today. Eve carried these memories for the rest of her life, and when she finally shared them before she died, she wanted her children to understand what had been lost. She wanted them to know that the broken world they were living in was not the original design. Something far greater had existed, and it was still waiting to be restored. But here's where this story takes an even more fascinating turn: the Cave of Treasures. After Adam died, Eve didn't collapse in grief and fade away quietly. She lived for exactly 6 more days. This wasn't a random number of days. It was deeply symbolic. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Eve survived her husband by 6 days to mirror that same pattern. During those 6 days, she became the only person on earth who actually remembered what paradise felt like. Her children had been born outside the garden. They had never seen the glowing trees or heard the animals speak. They had never felt the warmth of that luminous light covering their skin. But Eve had. She was the bridge between 2 worlds. She was the living memory of what humanity had lost. Eve used those 6 days wisely. She didn't spend them mourning in silence. She transferred every memory of everything she knew about the garden to her son Seth. She wanted him to know exactly what Eden had been like, so that future generations wouldn't mistake the broken world for their true home. This was an act of profound love and responsibility. She knew that if the memory of paradise was lost, her descendants would settle for far less than what God had intended for them. So she spoke. She described the light, the animals, the rivers, and the trees. She painted a picture with her words so vivid that Seth could almost see it himself. This oral tradition became the foundation for all the stories that were later written down in the Ethiopian texts. But here's what most people don't know. Eve didn't just pass down memories. She also guarded physical relics from the garden itself. According to the ancient scrolls, Adam and Eve took 3 items with them when they were expelled from paradise. They carried gold, incense, and myrrh. These weren't random objects they grabbed on their way out. They were tokens of the promise. God allowed them to take these items as a sign that one day, humanity would return to the garden. The gold represented kingship. The incense represented priesthood. The myrrh represented sacrifice. These 3 elements later show up again in one of the most famous stories in the Bible, when the wise men brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the infant Jesus. But the connection goes back much further. It starts with Adam and Eve storing these treasures in a place called the Cave of Treasures. The Cave of Treasures became the first sacred space outside of Eden. It was where Adam and Eve lived after they were cast out. It was where they prayed, where they mourned, and where they stored the relics from paradise. This cave wasn't just a shelter. It was the first church on earth. It was the place where humanity began to worship God outside the boundaries of the garden. Eve spent her final days in this cave. She sat at the entrance, looking out at the world her disobedience had cursed. But she also looked inward, remembering the world she had left behind. During those 6 days, she experienced something that would shape how people understood death for thousands of years to come. On the 4th day after Adam's death, Eve had a vision. She saw a chariot of light descending from the sky. It was pulled by 4 enormous eagles. It was so bright that she had to shield her eyes. The chariot came through what she described as a rip in the heavens. It landed near the cave. She watched as Adam's soul was carried inside. The vision didn't stop there. She saw him being taken to a place called the Lake of Acherusian. This was a crystal-clear body of water that existed in the heavenly realm. Adam's soul was washed in that lake 3 times. Each time he was submerged, more of his former glory returned. By the 3rd washing, his skin began to glow again. The luminous garment he had lost in the garden was being restored. Eve watched this entire process unfold before her eyes. It changed everything she understood about death. Before this vision, death seemed like the ultimate punishment. It was the final consequence of eating the forbidden fruit. But now Eve understood that death was not the end. It was a doorway. It was a return home. Adam wasn't being destroyed. He was being restored. This gave Eve hope in a way she hadn't felt since leaving the garden. She realized that even though she and Adam had made a terrible mistake, God's plan for redemption was already in motion. Death wasn't just a curse. It was part of the healing process. This vision became one of the central themes of her final testimony. She wanted her children to know that death was not something to fear. It was the beginning of a journey back to the light they had lost. The vision also revealed something about the nature of heaven itself. The Lake of Acherusian wasn't just a symbol. It was a real place with real water that had the power to wash away the stain of sin. This idea of being cleansed and restored in a heavenly lake appears in later Jewish and Christian writings, but it starts here with Eve's vision. She was the first person to see what happens to the soul after death. She was the first to witness the process of purification that takes place in the afterlife. This knowledge gave her authority to speak about things that no one else could confirm. She became a prophetess in her final days, delivering truths that would echo through the ages. As the 6th day approached, Eve knew her time was almost over. She gathered her strength for one final act. She called all of her living descendants to the mountain where the Cave of Treasures stood. This wasn't a small family gathering. By this point, there were thousands of people alive. They all came. They all listened. And what Eve told them next shaped the future of humanity in ways they couldn't possibly understand. The prophecy of fire and the final reunion. The assembly on the mountain was unlike anything that had ever happened before. Eve stood before thousands of her descendants. These were her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond. Most of them had never heard her speak at length about the garden. They knew the basic story, but they didn't know the details. Now, in her final hours, she was ready to tell them everything. She didn't come to them as a broken sinner begging for forgiveness. She stood as a prophetess and a queen. She had lived longer than anyone else on earth at that point. She had seen more, experienced more, and suffered more than any of them could imagine. She had earned the right to speak. They listened with absolute attention. Eve began by reminding them of what had been lost. She described the garden in vivid detail. She told them about the light that glowed from within the trees, the animals that spoke with wisdom, and the presence of God that filled every corner of paradise. She wanted them to understand that the world they were living in was not normal. It was broken. It was cursed. It was a shadow of what God had originally created. But she also told them that the brokenness wouldn't last forever. God had a plan to restore everything. Then she delivered the first recorded prophecy in human history. Eve predicted 2 great reckonings that would come upon the earth. The first would be a washing by water. She said that one day, the corruption of humanity would become so great that God would have to cleanse the earth with a flood. This wasn't a vague warning. It was a specific prediction. She told them that the water would cover the mountains and destroy everything that had breath. Only a small remnant would survive. This prophecy came true thousands of years later with Noah and the Great Flood. Eve saw it coming long before it happened. She warned her descendants to prepare their hearts and to pass down the memory of this prophecy so that future generations would recognize the signs. However, the second reckoning was far more intense. Eve said that after the flood, there would come a day when the earth would be tested by fire. This wouldn't just be a localized disaster. It would consume the heavens and the earth at the very end of time. Everything would burn. Everything would be purified. From the ashes, a new creation would emerge. This prophecy points toward what scriptures later called the Day of the Lord, or the final judgment. Eve was the first to speak it. She saw the entire arc of human history laid out before her in that moment. She saw the beginning, the middle, and the end. She wanted her children to know that no matter how dark things became, God's plan would ultimately triumph. But here's the part that changes everything. Eve didn't stop with warnings. She also gave them a promise. She revealed what the ancient text calls the secret number. She swore that after 5,500 years, the Word of God would physically walk back through the gates of Eden to bring her children home. This number became incredibly important in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. They built their entire calendar around it. They calculated the years from creation and waited for the fulfillment of Eve's prophecy. According to their reckoning, the promise was fulfilled when Jesus Christ was born. He was the Word of God made flesh. He was the one who would reopen the gates of paradise and lead humanity back to the garden. Eve saw this coming more than 5 millennia before it happened. She knew that her mistake in Eden wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward redemption. As Eve finished speaking, her strength began to fade. She had given everything she had to her descendants. She had passed down the memories, the warnings, and the promises. Now it was time for her to join Adam. Her sons prepared her body for burial. They carried her into the cave of treasures and laid her to rest directly to the right of Adam. The moment her body was placed beside his, something extraordinary happened. A supernatural fragrance filled the cave. It wasn't the smell of death or decay. It was the scent of gold and spices, sweet and overwhelming. The fragrance was so strong that it could be smelled for miles. People standing far from the cave stopped in their tracks. They caught the scent on the wind. This wasn't a coincidence. The release of that fragrance was a sign. It marked the reunion of the two halves of humanity. Adam and Eve were together again, not in paradise, but in death. In that moment, their love story came full circle. They had been created together, separated by sin, and now reunited in the grave. The fragrance was God's way of saying that their journey was complete. They had suffered. They had repented. They had passed down the truth to their children. Now they were at peace. The people who witnessed this moment understood that death was not the end. It was a doorway to something greater. It was a return to the light they had lost. Eve's final testimony has been preserved in the Ethiopian texts for over 1,000 years. The monks who guarded these scrolls understood that this wasn't just an interesting story. It was a vital piece of history that the world needed to hear. But for centuries, these details were kept out of the mainstream Bible. Some scholars believe this was intentional. They suggest that early church leaders wanted to portray Eve only as a symbol of weakness and failure. They didn't want people to see her as a powerful prophetess who delivered some of the most important predictions in human history. So they removed parts of the text that showed her strength and authority. They focused only on her mistake and ignored everything she did after the fall. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Church refused to let the full story die. They preserved the texts. They passed them down through generations. They protected the memory of Eve's final days and the prophecies she delivered. Now, thousands of years later, the world is finally beginning to rediscover what Eve really said before she died. Her testimony challenges everything we've been taught about the Garden of Eden, about the nature of light and life, and about the ultimate destiny of humanity. She wasn't just the first woman. She was the first prophetess, the first memory keeper. and the first person to see what happens to the soul after death. Her story deserves to be told in full, without edits or omissions. The Ethiopian texts give us that full story in vivid, unforgettable detail. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think Eve's final testimony changes how we should understand the story of Eden? Or do you believe the traditional version is complete on its own? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.